Woke Hypocrisies piece that I published this week in Natural Selections, in which one of the things I was talking about, which we also talked about in our private Q&A last week, was sort of why it seems to be okay to dress up in what I'm now calling womanface, either as drag or in its more egregious form, trans, when it's a trans rights activist, as opposed to someone who is really deeply gender dysphoric and absolutely needs this in order to feel like they can live their best life, which is a very tiny number of people. Whereas the world, I would argue, correctly says actually blackface, not so cool. And it's not cultural appropriation, as some have said. It's phenotypic mimicry. And it's generally phenotypic mimicry with an eye towards mockery. And that's what it is. Phenotypic mockery is what it is what blackface is. And frankly, I would argue, womanface, although many would say, oh, it's not mockery. Well, you see these exaggerated makeup, especially on drag queens, and it looks like mockery. At least it feels that way to myself and many other women who see people in drag and in trans outfits. I went looking. One of the regions of the internet I had not heretofore explored was what happens to the interface of drag queens and blackface.
Some dangerous clicks involved in that investigation.
Some dangerous clicks, and interestingly, I didn't find anything super modern. Everything was from a few years ago, but there are a number of these stories, and I just want to put out there one of them, in which let's see, this is in all of the cases, there is some drag queens who are shocked at the racism of one of their members, in which he, a white man, does a character as a black woman. And, I don't find these characters funny at all for all of the reasons, but, some people apparently do. But what's strange to me is the outrage, the complete lack of self-awareness in which the drag queens are saying things like, and here's a direct quote from one of these stories: "The whole concept of blackface being an art form or being entertainment, to me, it doesn't make sense at all that anyone would think it's okay," said Alfonso King, who performs drag under the name Jade Electra. The whole concept, let's just change blackface to womanface. The whole concept of womanface being an art form or being entertainment, to me, it doesn't make sense at all that anyone would think that's okay. Now, maybe the difference is that some number of people who are doing drag as a form of entertainment will say, I'm celebrating womanhood. Well, it doesn't read that way to a lot of us. And I don't think almost anyone who goes out in blackface thinks or would even claim that they're celebrating blackness. I think that is going to be one distinction that people will make. But it lives as a inconsistency that I now can't unsee. That you have people who are so embedded in what they're calling an art form of adopting the looks and the artifacts of the opposite sex, and doing so without any regard for how that will be regarded by the opposite sex, who can stand up and say, you must be fired, you must stop doing that, that's not allowed, when it's about adopting a phenotypic indicator of a race that they're not. It is, at the very least, an inconsistency. I read it as hypocrisy, and I also read it as something that other people have tried to engage this. This whole concept of transracialism, right? Like you can't be transracial, except that, and I make this point in the Woke Hypocrisies piece. Sex is actually real and ancient and binary. And for at least 500 million years, and probably closer to 1 to 2 billion years, we have been in a lineage that has been reproducing sexually with two and only two sexes. And every single human being who is among your ancestors has been either male or female. That is true. Whereas race, to the extent that it has biological reality, is much more muddled. Those borders are muddled. There is no pure anything in race because we are sexually reproducing. This is actually one of the weird points here, right? Like, because we are sexually reproducing and have been forever, basically, yeah, not quite, but almost forever, there is no pure race. That's a fiction. That is the fantasists, who are racist, who would tell you that there is purity of race. So there may be people who are all from, Scotland, and all of their ancestors from time immemorial, but nowhere close to 500 million years, have been, Scottish. And there may be people who are, similarly Lithuanian or, whatever. But every single new person is the result of sexual reproduction, and therefore there's no purity there. And so if transracialism isn't a thing, transsexualism really is not.
All right. There's a bunch there.
Yeah.
I think there are a couple things that need highlighting. One, I think the point you're making can be well encapsulated by saying, is there a meaningful distinction to be drawn between a minstrel show and a drag show?
I heard menstrual.
Menstrual show.
Not a thing. Thankfully. Minstrel show and a drag show. Yes. Yes.
Minstrel show
there you go.
And a drag show. And I would argue there are distinctions you could draw, but those distinctions are subtle at best, and what they tell you is actually, you should sit down for this, actually, neither of these things can be a minstrel show and a drag show. Put the shows aside. You can't rule out blackface, right? Why? Because the character of Roger needs to do a minstrel show at his daughter's wedding, right?
On Mad Men.
On Mad Men.
You dropped the lead there. So you've got a character, a white man on the show Mad Men, who...
behaving in a racist way.
The actor is allowed to put on blackface to play the character who is being abominable.
Thank you for filling in all of that. Yes, necessary.
Roger is not actually sufficient to get most people there.
Right. Likewise,
yes.
Monty Python has to be able to do preposterous caricatures of women.
Lumberjacks.
No, it's not the lumberjack. It's all of the characters where the Monty Python dudes, he's not the Messiah. He's a very naughty boy. That thing, right?
As Brian's mother.
Right, Brian's mother, for example.
In The Life of Brian, yes.
Right. So the point is that there's nothing offensive, in my opinion, about the Monty Python thing. And in fact, it is mocking itself in its own way. The ridiculous portrayals of female are so silly, right, that's part of the comedy. The importance of blackface to the character of Roger in Mad Men, mind you.
Nicely done.
The importance of that character's cringy minstrel show at his daughter's wedding is fundamental to the plot.
Yeah. Was it really his daughter's wedding?
I believe so.
I don't remember that part, but anyway.
I believe it was. But anyway, point is, in a civilized society, right, it is fine to make a rule like blackface is not cool, because it isn't.
Yeah.
Right? That does not mean there are no edge cases in which you have to allow it, right, or where it's important, right? And likewise, last week we talked about, Victor, Victoria, Mrs. Doubtfire,
I believe we talked about
buddies.
that in our private Q&A.
Oh, was that private? Anyway, so those examples plus Monty Python, those examples all are cases in which there's a very strong defense to be made of something which in another context would be troubling. I don't know exactly what to think about drag shows. I don't know that they're identical to minstrel shows and that we will come to understand that or not. But I do think...
I think, never having been to either, that the people engaging in the blackface or the womanface will have different stories to tell. That the minstrel shows, which aren't a thing anymore, from let's call it the 1920s, had people donning blackface knowing that they were proudly making fun of black people. And that drag shows in 100 years later, and it's not a fair comparison because it's 100 years later, but that at this point anyway, drag shows, I think it is going to be the rare drag performer who will say, of course I'm making fun of women. That's not going to be the cover story, right? So there's an important distinction there, but one which we have to try to correct for the difference in time between when they're happening.
I actually think it's almost the opposite thing that's bugging you and that has you focused on this. I do think that a drag show, I've never been to one either.
Yeah.
A drag show from 30 years ago involves men who do have a strong affinity for femaleness, who do aspire to it in some sense.
It's autogynophiles.
Right.
Many of them.
Fair enough. But
right.
the point is that's very different than mocking. Mm-hmm. Right? And I think what you're responding to is that as trans activism has become hostile to women, mm-hmm. right, this has gone from a weird aspiration.
A niche fetish.
A niche fetish, but nonetheless something that is desirous enough of being woman mm-hmm. that it will, play act, mm-hmm. right, to being a threat to women in declaring that this is synonymous with being a woman, right? Mm-hmm. And that is actually the thing. It's gone, and that minstrel shows were never that. They were never, as far as I know, they were never
what you were purporting a drag show from 30 years ago would have been.
Right, exactly. And
yeah, that may be right. Yeah.
And there's one other distinction I want to draw. For our entire lives, people have often equated racism and sexism, and therefore the fights against them.
Right.
This is a mistake.
Yeah.
They are not symmetrical, right? You've got two different types of oppression and disadvantage, right? One of them is more pernicious than the other. They may be both terribly frustrating, but it makes perfect evolutionary sense for one lineage to oppress another lineage, to drive another lineage to extinction, whatever.
Perfect evolutionary sense while being an abomination.
It's an abomination, but the point is it is not illogical. It mm-hmm. is immoral, but not illogical. Mm-hmm. This has never been what went on between males and females, because males and females share a lineage, and every individual effectively is arbitrarily cast into one of these roles at the point the zygote is formed. And the rest of the genes in the genome don't know whether they're going to live out this life male or female. Mm-hmm. And so the point is the idea that male genes gang up on female genes doesn't make any sense, because most of the genes spend half their time as each one. Mm-hmm. So
male individuals will try to control the behavior and placement of female individuals, as has happened forever. But male genes ganging up on female genes, except with regard to something like genomic imprinting on the fetus, where, just to do a little David Haig style thing very, very briefly here, in a situation in which a mother, a pregnant woman is pregnant with a man who may not be the father of her future children, she has an interest in having a child who is as healthy as possible, but also retaining her ability to have future children. And so we have, as humans, a problem, a trade-off, where we want our kids to be born as late as possible, as fully cooked as possible, so that they are maximally likely to survive, but we have gigantic heads. And for women to have pelvises as wide as would be optimal for the birth to be safe would make women very, very unstable, basically. And so childbirth is not just painful, but quite dangerous, precisely because there's a trade-off between size of the child's head at birth and how fully cooked it is, and therefore how likely it is to survive. And so a woman who is pregnant simultaneously wants that child to survive, but also wants to be able to still be reproductively capable for future children. And so the genes in the fetus that were inherited from her, some of them are more likely to tend towards a slightly smaller head size on birth, so that she is able to not just take care of that child, but future children. Whereas, and those genes are so-called imprinted. So the fetus has genes that are imprinted from mother that he or she inherited from mother, and those that are paternally inherited, that are imprinted from dad. I'm not sure I'm saying that exactly the right way, imprinted from dad, but that dad's genes, especially in a polygynous society, are more likely to drive the head of that child to be larger on birth, so that the child is more fully formed on birth.
But even in that case, the male who loves them and leaves them has an interest in that female surviving to raise the offspring, because it's very unlikely to survive if she doesn't.
Absolutely, but this is not just theoretical work, right? Like Haig has demonstrated, this is work, David Haig, Harvard in the 90s, I think, right? And it's been followed through with a lot more that we're not going to go into now, but it is known that genomic imprinting is true, and that maternally imprinted genes and paternally imprinted genes are in disagreement. In this one small way, with regard to, for instance, the degree to which the child is fully cooked on birth.
They have a limited,
cooked not being the technical term.
They have a limited disagreement, and the point in this context, the point is that disagreement is not limited between lineages, which we wrongly call races, but nonetheless, the distinction between race-on-race oppression and sex-on-sex oppression is no comparison at all. They're very different. And the fact is, individual women may suffer from the fact that power is very asymmetrically distributed in civilization, less so, but it has been very asymmetrically distributed. But there are women at every strata, right, at every level of well-being, and the distinction between that and what happens in races is a major one. So if there is, the argument here has been, there might be some distinction between a minstrel show and a drag show, but it's awfully hard to explain exactly what it's based on. And even this fundamental difference between race and sex oppression does not suggest an obvious distinction other than the one we've talked about, where a drag show could be something other than mockery. It could be aspiration, and I don't think minstrel shows ever are.
Yes, I agree.